Nu det sista programmet i vår serie om Saudi-Arabien. Oljan, pengarna och makten.
Afton och välkomna till den tredje och sista delen i serien Tema Saudi-Arabien, oljan, pengarna och makten. De tidigare inslagen i serien har handlat om den enväldiga Saud-dynastin som härskar över en fjärdedel av jordens kända oljereserver, om historien och den växande konflikten mellan konservativa muslimska värderingar och den västerländska teknologin och levnadsstilen. Kung Faisal blev själv för några år sedan ett offer för den konflikten när han mördades av en nära släkting. Och den blodiga ockupationen av den stora moskén i Mekka för 2 år sedan är ett annat exempel på motsättningar i världens ledande oljerike. Kvällens program handlar om hur Saudi-Arabien med sina väldiga olje- och penningtillgångar försöker finna sin plats i världspolitiken. Saudi-Arabien har inte bara en nyckelställning i världen vad gäller tillgången på olja och vad vi ska betala för oljan och bensin, utan Saudi-Arabien har också genom åren som en eftergift åt västvärlden faktiskt sålt mer olja och skaffat sig större inkomster än vad man egentligen behöver och kan förbruka. Varje dag tjänar man 600 miljoner kronor mer än vad landet förbrukar och egentligen behöver. Det är pengar som man investerar i främst USA och i Västeuropa. Och de här väldiga tillgångarna av pengar kan vara ett allvarligt hot mot världens finansiella och ekonomiska utveckling. Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, den välkände oljeministern, medger att de här pengarna kan ställa till en stor skada för hela världen. Om till exempel Saudi-Arabien skulle skifta sina tillgångar till någon annan valuta. Det skulle betyda fullständigt kaos på finansmarknaden i världen. Men vi behöver västerlandet lika mycket som ni behöver oss, säger han. Oljan, pengarna och makten är temat i det tredje och sista avsnittet av Tema Saudi-Arabien.
Today, Saudi Arabia, a country of 5 million people, has more than 1/4 of the world's oil reserves and is the world's largest exporter of oil. It has literally doubled its share of the world export market over the last decade and now is the major supplier to the United States, Italy, France, and Japan as it pumps more than 8 million barrels a day. All of these figures make them the single most important factor in the oil world. Wanda Jablonski is one of the world's leading oil analysts and editor of Petroleum Intelligence Weekly. What proportion of OPEC's production does Saudi Arabia account for?
Their share of the total OPEC production at the moment is very high. It's about 40%. But that's in OPEC. But in the world, they control something like 30% of the whole world's oil.
This, in fact, gives them the controlling voice in OPEC, a control the Saudis wield when necessary. On March 20th, 1982, Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani announced that the Saudis would cut oil production to counter the lingering oil glut. They then led the bickering cartel to establish a ceiling on production and a floor on prices. How much oil they decide to pump and the price they put on it has enormous ramifications for the rest of the world. A fact Ahmed Zaki Yamani, Saudi Minister of Petroleum, was extremely aware of during the last shortage.
Saudi Arabia is producing at least 4 million barrels more than what we need. If I assume that Saudi Arabia will decide tomorrow to do only what is necessary for Saudi Arabia by cutting a minimum of 4 million barrels from the market, what will be the result? Immediately there will be a panic. The price of oil will jump from 35 or 36 or from our 32 to something at least like 45 per barrel. You have definitely to go into rationing. You have to stop driving your automobiles the way you do right now. You have to take care of the thermostat so that it won't exceed something like 60 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of things will be done. This is just a small example to show the importance of Saudi Arabia and the significance on your everyday life.
The politics behind Saudi Arabia's production and pricing have always been complicated but decipherable. Historically, it's been a balancing act between conflicting and shifting demands of OPEC nations, the consumers, and Saudi domestic considerations. Throughout the shortages, the West has urged the Saudis to produce more oil. The Saudis have done so, but reluctantly. The money generated from such a large production has been more than the small population of 5 million people could absorb quickly. Domestic development can only go so fast before inflation and social disruptions set in. The money they have had left over has gone into investments in the West, and it is these facts that have led Saudi Arabia to their two basic decisions over the years: to keep their production up to satisfy the West, and their prices lower to stabilize both their economy and that of the Western world. These decisions have led to a considerable degree of animosity with some of their fellow OPEC members, who have pushed for higher prices, and with little thanks from the West, according to former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, John West.
A day. The Saudis felt that they were not getting proper recognition or proper appreciation for their conservative position on pricing. They pointed out that they were keeping the prices down largely in response to our request, because we recognized in the United States that any price increase in oil increased inflation. And they felt that $100 million a day of lost revenue was a pretty high price to pay for anything, and they felt that particularly when they weren't given any thanks about it. I know one very prominent Saudi official very much involved in the pricing and production policies of the kingdom, and he said it's a very difficult sort of a situation to get into, because we're accused of being puppets or surrogates of the Americans. But he said what really becomes rather distressing to us after an OPEC meeting, we see the headlines: the thieving Arabs have done it again.
The Saudis, as I said, have 30% of the world's oil in a country that has a very tiny population. So they don't need very much production to satisfy their fiscal needs. They have far more oil than they could use for the next 100 years. Now, other countries like Nigeria or Algeria or Indonesia have tremendous populations and very little oil proportionately. So they want to get everything possible out of each barrel of oil so that they can use it to develop their economies. So they want the highest possible price because they have very little oil and they see it being dwindled. So very understandably and logically, that's in their self-interest. And very understandably, in the Saudi interest, it's to take the long-term view, and because they're producing so much to help us out, quote, to help us out, but because they realize that they're part of our world. If we crash, they crash too.
The Saudis have very little interest in crashing. Since 1978, they have generally acted as a moderating force within OPEC and will continue to do so. In August 1981, Yamani pulled the plug on the most recent oil price spiral by reducing their price, thus forcing the other countries to do so.
Some countries will definitely start as of tomorrow reducing their prices.
To soften the blow for the other OPEC nations, the Saudis agreed to cut their production.
Saudi Arabia, as a gesture, had decided to cut the level of production for the month of September.
Yamani's long-term concerns about Western stability under escalating prices has recently been fueled by a second concern: fears that the oil market will dry up if prices go too high. In a September 1981 speech in Dhahran, Yamani bluntly stated that the West could have alternative energy systems operating in a few years if prices forced them to. and that to lose that market and the income by the end of the decade would, quote, spell disaster for Saudi Arabia. Yamani's ultimate goal is to sell OPEC a fixed price plan, which would keep price increases at or below the rate of inflation through 1986.
If we have small annual increases in the price of oil, by this we avoid the sharp increases. By this we enable the industrialist in your country to plan for the future, because then they know that by the year 87, the price of oil will be more or less that much. And by the year 95, it will be that much. Also, you can predict, which is very important. You shouldn't really stay in the dark. For us, as producers, we can plan for the future. We'll know exactly how much we have to invest in order to increase our production or to explore for more oil.
No matter what happens on the oil prices, one thing is already certain. Saudi Arabia's oil revenues, which go to the government, have already made it one of the wealthiest countries on the face of the earth. It now has so much money that Saudis are reluctant to discuss it. Mohammed Abakhail is the Saudi Minister of Finance. How much surplus a year do you have after domestic expenditures for foreign investments?
Well, it is less than what is in certain news or newspaper, and it's different from time to time. I think it's really hard to say a certain figure simply because I cannot. It's not. I cannot know exactly what is the surplus today. I mean, this time, maybe it will be less or more than the figure I have in mind.
The Saudis now make $155 billion a year. Today, after they've paid for total care of every Saudi's basic needs and all the development they can think of, they are still left with over $100 million a day, which adds up to a staggering surplus. Dr. Lawrence Klein is the 1980 Nobel Prize winner in economics.
They have, at the present time, accumulated well over $100 billion from the past years. I would guess that by middle of the 1980s, say by 1985, they ought to have about between 200 and 300 billion, and by 1990, be probably between 300 and 400 billion.
The kind of clout that gives them over world finances is enormous and the subject of enormous concern. A CIA memo of 1978 stated that, quote, temporary dislocation of international financial markets would ensue if the Saudi Arabian government ever chose to use its accumulated wealth as a political weapon.
There have been frequently expressed fears that with the money that the Saudis have, they can control all the major companies of the world. Well, that hasn't proved to be the case. I was present at a gathering of United States senators, and one of them saw at Sheikh Yamani's home, the oil minister Yamani, the book, The Crash of '79, on his bookshelf, and the senator asked the sheikh, said, have you read that book? He said, I didn't finish it. I quit at the point I was assassinated. So the fact is that the people running the financial affairs of the Saudi Arabian government recognize the potential that control of such huge sums of money give them.
Of course, with the money we have, we can do a lot of harm. We can move the assets from one currency to another. We can harm one nation one day and harm another nation the other day. But nothing of this could be feared from Saudi Arabia. We know that we do need you. You will industrialize Saudi Arabia. You can offer Saudi Arabia technology. We invest the surplus money which we have in your economy, and therefore we have an interest to see that your economy is growing, that you don't face any unnecessary recession or so on.
The Saudis, in fact, have tied themselves inextricably to the economy of the West. Vahan Zanoyan is the director of Wharton Middle East Economic Service and a leading Middle East economist.
Because Saudis themselves are as vulnerable when it comes to their investments in the Western world as the Western world is. They have a vested interest in the economic and political stability of the West. And therefore, they are very careful in their conservative financial policy to sort of maintain financial stability and economic stability in the West.
Of course, if there is a crisis in the free world, there will be something much more dangerous than only prices. It will lead to upheaval, it will lead to political upheaval, lack of stability, and you cannot have prosperity and high standard of living parallel to upheaval and political turmoil.
They have, in fact, when it comes to investing official government funds, pursued one of the most conservative courses in history. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency is responsible for investing government funds, and its director, Abdulaziz Al-Quraishi, has been called the single largest investor in the world. What is the geographical distribution of your investments?
Well, we invest in the major financial center, mainly the United States, Europe, and Japan. Mainly in government papers, whether it's U.S. treasuries or U.K. treasuries or German Schuldschein or Japanese government securities, and also in corporate bonds and in medium-term bank deposits.
Secrecy is the official policy of SAMA. Given that, the leading economists offer the following as their latest guess. The Saudi surplus assets are increasing at a rate of $2 billion a month. By 1981, Saudi Arabia had close to $150 billion in official foreign assets. Nearly half of all Saudi investments were in the United States. They were the largest single investor in the U.S. government securities market, where they are assured confidentiality. In 1981 alone, 1 year of fresh investments, the Saudi government bought $16 billion worth of assets in the United States, $10.7 billion in government securities, that's treasury bonds and notes, $1.6 billion in company stocks, and $3.7 billion in private sector bonds, the corporate way of borrowing money. The Saudi government now holds issues of AT&T, IBM, U.S. Steel, GM, Texas Utilities, to name a few. Their official policy has been to limit their holdings to a maximum of 5% equity in any company, which means they can avoid disclosure. The other form of official government foreign investment is foreign aid. Since 1974, they have become one of the 4 biggest donors in the world. They annually give away about 10% of the kingdom's gross national income to consolidate allies. Receiving an average of $4 billion apiece, these recipients now span the various continents.
The Saudis have set up funds for their friends who are oil importers, or for their friends who are in a much less fortunate position. They have put money into areas of the Middle East, Sudan, Egypt, other countries in Africa with which they are friendly, and have helped them meet their oil bills without recycling them, without recycling the money through the Western banking system.
The Saudi money picture also involves the enormous sums of money flowing from wealthy Saudi individuals, and it has been a comparative free-for-all when it comes to the private sector and what they buy, what they invest in.
We don't have any control, any restrictions on the flow of money. You can, any Saudis, any non-Saudis can transfer his income, his wealth to any currency, to any place. There is no any restriction.
They buy cars, they buy machinery, they buy plants, they buy petrochemical installations, they buy desalination projects, all of these kinds of things. I think you ought to say the whole business world, business and financial world, is eager. If you go into a hotel lobby, as I'm sure you have in an oil exporting country, you'll see electronic salesmen, you'll see steel salesmen, you'll see fleet sellers of cars, and you will see bankers, and they're all doing their business together. There's a pot of gold there, and they're all trying to dip into it.
Saudi Arabia today is the most rapidly expanding market for U.S. exports. Total Saudi imports, estimated at $39 billion for 1981 alone, are increasing by 25% every year. Saudi private investments in the United States are increasing as well.
They started by going to London first, or Europe. A lot of investment went into Europe, and London particularly. And you will notice that the market in there sort of shot up because of what is known as the Arab invasion and Arab invasion. So as people started looking beyond Europe, United States became a natural.
You can find a lot of investment in this country, in the U.S., in Florida, in Texas, in the Boston area. A lot of Saudi individuals are buying buildings, office buildings. Some of them are buying hotels, and some of them are buying apartment buildings. The important Saudi businessmen are buying banks, are buying companies, buying shares also in companies.
The flow of Saudi money into the United States, however, has been constrained by what the Saudis perceive as a hostile reaction. Abdullah Ali Reza heads up one of the largest Saudi business enterprises.
The biggest problem, as you know, in the United States was the feeling that the United States is not encouraging Arab money to come in. In fact, actually, many articles have been written about Arab takeover of industry, and as a result, our investment in the United States has been very, very low-key, and in areas that attract very little attention, and in amount that represents less than the required amount for disclosure.
Despite the problems, the bulk of Saudi funds is invested in the U.S. They now find themselves with so much public and private money invested in the United States that the Saudis have, as Yamani says, as much interest in the prosperity and stability of the West as the West does. And the West concurrently has an equal stake in the stability of Saudi Arabia.
But if Saudi Arabia were to go under in such a way, in a violent way or a restrictive way, so that oil exports were cut off, there would be disaster in the world economic system. The Western industrial world economies could not easily survive a cutoff of the oil supplies that come from Saudi Arabia.
The most frightening thing in the world to me, or one of the more frightening things, is to contemplate what would happen if the present government of Saudi Arabia were not to survive. If, for example, a Gaddafi or Khomeini came into power in place of the Saud family, where would we in the Western world be with our dependence upon Middle East oil? Our future is intertwined with the future of the Saud family, and we've got about as much stake in seeing them survive in their present form as they themselves have.
The West is more nervous than ever about the Saudis' survival possibilities because of this man, Ayatollah Khomeini. This was shot at his encampment outside of Paris in December of 1978, where I met with him to broadcast the first interview for the United States on the McNeil-Lehrer Report on Public Broadcasting. His statement that he would overthrow the Shah of Iran was widely dismissed despite massive obvious unrest in Iran. 6 weeks later, he controlled the country. The question is continuously asked, will the same fate befall the Saudi government? How stable are they? How do they rule? And who are they anyhow? King Fahad, along with recently deceased King Khalid and all of their relatives, are direct descendants of Ibn Saud, the man who founded the present-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The family today is enormous. One of Ibn Saud's main winning tactics was to marry and then procreate for support as well as to fight for it. And so the number of Sauds is boggling.
I don't know all the members of the family. Sometimes when we meet, we're introduced by somebody else who is not outside of the family. Yes.
How many members of the royal family do you estimate there are now?
I don't really know now, but it must be more than 3,000.
They're very concerned about looking either too royal in today's world or too much as though the government is a family enterprise.
The royal family, the Saudi family. I mean, I don't want to use the the term royal family, because actually we are just a family like other families in this country. So we don't get together and decide the policies of this country. I mean, the government is doing this. And the government is not of the royal family. We have, of course, the king is from the royal family, the crown prince is from the royal family, but the council of ministers not all composed from the royal family. Some of the Saudi family also are officers in the army and the air force and the navy. I can tell you something, some of our young people of our family are football players.
Members of the royal family do staff most of the key posts. King, crown prince, ministers of foreign affairs, defense, head of intelligence, governors of the major provinces. Who they are and how they actually govern is a fascinating mix of Desert Kingdom and the modern world. Khalid was king from 1975 until his death in 1982. He succeeded his brothers Faisal and Saud and was in turn succeeded by another brother, Fahad. These brothers have formed the older Saudi generation in power. Their schooling was the Quran and desert lore instead of formal Western-style education. They have found their powers broad, but in fact limited. In Saudi Arabia, there is no formal constitution, no political parties, and no national elections. But the king's powers are limited by the fact that he must maintain a consensus of the royal family, the religious leaders, chiefs of the important tribes, the armed forces, and the bureaucracy. There is no question but that if the religious elders and the majority of the royal family are not pleased with the job he's doing, he will be removed as King Saud was in 1964. Saud continuously spent the treasury into debt, mismanaged the country's affairs, and was taken off the throne and replaced by his brother Faisal. To maintain a consensus of the various elements in the society is the first order of business for the House of Saud. They are clear on the fact that unless the majority of the population is happy, their reign will be short-lived. And such a consensus requires a fairly tricky juggling act to balance the interests of the younger, more urban technocrats with the rural, more conservative tribal leaders and religious elders. Khalid throughout his life remained popular among the people, even though his ailing health kept him to a limited schedule. Many of his duties fell to Crown Prince Fahad, and so few changes in Saudi policy are expected now that Fahad has assumed the throne. King Fahad was born in 1922 and has carried on the major activities of state for years. He is viewed as one of the most pro-Western, pro-American members of the older generation. He is also thought to frequently be a force for compromise within the private sessions in which the royal family and the various ministers work out decisions. He is a member of one of the more prominent groups within the royal family, called the Sudari Seven. This is made up of King Fahad and 6 brothers who are all the sons of one of Ibn Saud's more famous and powerful wives, Hafsa bint Sudari. Within a family as large as the House of Saud, there are groupings, and this is perhaps the most powerful. They not only hold major ministerial positions from defense to interior, but also account for 11 out of 14 governors of the various provinces. Another group of the royal family centers around Crown Prince Abdullah, commander of the National Guard, next in line for the throne after Fahad. He is viewed as a balance to the Sudari group domestically, and a man with a conservative, traditional Arab world point of view internationally. He has been the prime mediator in many of the Arab world questions, such as the Syrian-Jordanian clash, and has long-standing personal relationships with many of the current-day Arab leaders. He is also in constant touch with the tribal chiefs, whose sons make up his National Guard. Next in line for succession is assumed to be Prince Sultan, Minister of Defense, since he was 35 years old. The next center of power, that of the younger generation of the royal family, revolves around the sons of the late King Faisal. These are men who have received a distinctly Western education and interact easily with the West. Prince Saud, the foreign minister, was educated in the United States, as were all of Faisal's 8 sons. A graduate of Princeton, he speaks perfect English, as does a second power among the younger generation, his brother, Prince Turki Faisal. Prince Turki went to high school and college in the U.S., Princeton, New York University, and Georgetown, and took a degree in international law from the University of London. He is now head of intelligence and foreign liaison for Saudi Arabia.
By becoming king and
There is constant speculation about whether the royal family is going to be able to hold on to the country. Do you have concerns as well about the royal family?
Oh, yes, we got the basic problems there, corruption and whatnot, that existed in Iran. It has all of those elements which does not provide for stability. And that is the fundamental problem.
I think it could be another Iran, but for somewhat different reasons. There's the problem of social dislocation in Saudi Arabia, the rapid urbanization of a tribal society. There's the problem of continuing corruption inside Saudi Arabia. I think that there will not be a popular revolution in Saudi Arabia, but rather one that will emanate from what is an increasingly political military. There's also a problem in that the Saudis are not sharing power with a variety of national groups, the burgeoning technocracy, the military, the middle class, and the like. The Saudis have a problem by virtue of more than 1.5 million aliens in the country, Arab aliens, Muslim aliens, and the like. That has an unsettling social effect. And finally, I think that the Saudis right now are not making the proper changes. They are not responding, but rather are tending towards an atavism. They are looking for answers in the past, and that does not seem to be effectively answering the social strains.
Fears of imminent problems in Saudi Arabia have been fairly thoroughly discounted by President Reagan, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor. They've all frequently stated that they view Saudi Arabia as basically moderate and stable. Regarding the long term, it is clear that the task before the Saudi government involved keeping 3 groups happy. The first is the religious conservatives. The incident of the Mecca Mosque being taken over in November of 1979 was instigated by a band of religious conservatives who thought the country was moving too far, too fast, and away from Islam. The House of Saud gained its throne fighting under the banner of Islam, and most feel that it must maintain this legitimacy to either succeed or survive. It therefore acts cautiously when it comes to change and modernization. The second group is the young technocrats, university-educated, often in the West, the United States, who have grown up in this era of affluence and who are a group with high expectations. So far, according to many analysts, these expectations have been met, and the ruling family has managed to keep in touch with both groups.
My feeling in Saudi Arabia is that country is far from an overthrow. That royal family created Saudi Arabia. It's a big tribal family, intermarried with all the key tribes of Saudi Arabia. That's why it's so huge, but it also, by that very definition, isn't something like an emperor sitting up here on a throne and the people down here. They're all interrelated. It's hard to find somebody who doesn't have a cousin who's a member of the royal family, and every other person is a prince of some kind. Now, sure, there are a lot of rich princes, and people in the West say, people are going to overthrow rich princes. But find me a Saudi who can't just have a house built for him by the government. He wants to go to school overseas, the government pays for it. He wants to start a farm, the government gives him the land, and we'll fly in the cows for him free. So he's, you know, as long as you're a Saudi, everything will be done for you. Everything is shared with the people in this kind of system. It's not something we can easily understand.
The third group is the armed forces, often the fatal element for other Middle Eastern regimes. William Quant is former director of the Middle East desk of the National Security Council. He is now at the Brookings Institution and author of a new book on Saudi Arabia.
So they've tried to do something which may work, but one has to be a little bit concerned about it. They're trying to technically develop a modern military, training officers, making them into military professionals, and at the same time keeping them very loyal to the regime. Now, one way of doing that is to ensure that in lots of key positions, members of the royal family are present as pilots, as commanders, as generals, and so forth. Another technique is to keep the armored corps of the army rather far from the main centers of population, so that the typical Middle East scenario of the tanks arriving in the capital city to seize the radio station and declare a new era is very unlikely to happen in Saudi Arabia. At least it would be logistically difficult. They've particularly tried to make sure that the Air Force remains loyal as the one element that might be able to intervene in the event that they had any military problems. And they're a bit sensitive about this because in the late 1960s, it does seem as if there was at least a rumble of dissidents within the Air Force, and the something like a minor plot was uncovered. So they're particularly sensitive about that. But so far, Saudi Arabia is almost unique among Middle East countries of not having had any serious challenge from the military to the ruling institutions.
The Saudis have worked actively to modernize and upgrade their military since the 1970s, because it is this group that the Saudis feel may sometime confront what they believe to be the most serious problem before them. Not defense from an internal threat, but from an external one. An encroachment upon the single most valuable piece of real estate in the world today, the oil fields.
Good heavens, it's all there. Just lying there. There's nothing to prevent anyone from walking in, dropping bombs, landing paratroopers. Well, who's to stop it? No. AWACS, sure, anything like that would help. But right now, it's just wide open for the taking.
Well, right now, there's almost no real serious defense of the oil fields against either external attack by air or by ground or against sabotage. If there were a threat to the Saudi oil fields today, say from Iran, and the Iranians were intent on bombing some sensitive part of the Saudi oil system, the loading docks or the gas and oil separation plants, the Saudis would probably have about 10 minutes of warning time.
The Saudis fear the overflow of regional hostilities, such as the Iran-Iraq war, and the long-term threat of the Soviets and Soviet-backed regimes. What are the threats confronting the Saudis today?
Well, I think we generally agree with the Saudis on the nature of the threat to Saudi Arabia and to some of the neighboring smaller states in the region. After the invasion of Afghanistan, given the proximity of the Soviet Union, given the turbulence in Iran after the revolution, one has to take account in a very serious way of the possibility of a direct Soviet military threat to the region. In addition, there is the long-standing threat of radical regimes supported by the Soviet Union. In South Yemen, which has had a war with North Yemen in the last several years, which has had a number of border fights with the Saudis in the last decade.
They feel that the Soviet military presence is getting closer and closer to the Arabian Peninsula, and that someday, either directly or indirectly, the Soviet Union can use its military force to pressure other countries in the region into making accommodations with the Soviets, with the objective of eventually gaining for Moscow access to Persian Gulf oil. That's their real fear, that the need for oil will someday bring the Soviets in as a military power to the Persian Gulf, and that they will then be a target of direct Soviet pressure. They don't seem to be concerned today that the Soviets will directly invade the Middle East by military force and seize the oil fields. What they really fear is the political, ideological offensive that will pick off countries one by one and neutralize them, bring them into the Soviet sphere of influence, isolate Saudi Arabia, and then bring great pressure to bear on them to make some kinds of concessions to the Soviets. That's their fear today.
What is the Russian oil situation, and do they have designs on Saudi oil?
Well, I tell you, Brezhnev has not been very cozy with me on his inner plans, but if I were sitting in his shoes, I sure would have my eyes on the Saudi oil, even if I didn't need the oil. We have just outlined, and everyone outlines, how vital Saudi Arabian oil is to the whole world. If it's that vital to the Western world, I would want to get control of it, or at least I would have some say on it. So in my geopolitical planning, I would consider that Persian Gulf and the oil around it as my #1 target.
The consensus is that whether or not the Soviets fall short of their own oil, as has sometimes been predicted as a possibility in the latter half of the 1980s, their long-term plans include Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia's long-term plans include what exactly to do about it.
What they have doubts about is whether the best way to resist Soviet influence is simply to cut them off entirely, to have nothing to do with them, or whether they might be better off by having some kind of a dialogue, by trying to get the Soviets to rein in some of their more radical neighbors, for example, South Yemen. The Saudi official position is that if the Soviets were to withdraw their troops from Afghanistan, then there would be no obstacle to normal relations between Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union. I think that it is likely sometime in the 1980s that Saudi Arabia and the Soviet Union will have an increased range of contacts. Now, in the end, part of whether the Saudis move this direction or don't move this direction will depend on how much confidence they have in the United States.
The Saudis are increasingly nervous about the U.S. as an ally. The U.S. policy they feel is inconsistent, unreliable, and oblivious to the issues and the feelings of the Arab world. Watching the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, many in Saudi Arabia, in fact, wonder if a close alliance with the U.S. doesn't put them in jeopardy. In short, the main foreign policy dilemmas confronting Saudi Arabia today are how to keep the Soviet Union at bay and how to have a relationship with the U.S. while the U.S. has a relationship with Israel. Neither have been easy. When it comes to the Soviet Union, the Saudis continue to decline on principle.
There is no doubt. كانت ستكون مقبولة لو أن الرئيس that the principle stated by President Brezhnev would have been acceptable had Brezhnev announced simultaneously the withdrawal of the Soviet forces from the sister state Afghanistan, the African Horn, Angola, Mozambique, and the other parts in Africa and Asia. And had he also declared the right of the peoples in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary to self-determination.
When it comes to the United States, the situation is trickier. This is a superpower relationship the Saudis want but can't seem to work out, despite the fact that they are entrenched in it at every level. When the Saudis concluded in the 1970s that they must develop a military, it was to the same country that developed their oil fields that they turned, the United States. The U.S. has aided in formulating their entire military machine to date.
Yeah, my title is Project Manager for the Saudi Arabian National Guard Modernization Program. My role is to do all the planning for the modernization of the National Guard, to also obtain all the equipment for the units through foreign military sales, and my job's also then to negotiate a contract with a civilian contractor who does all the training, and then to manage and supervise the contract and the contractor's performance.
U.S. personnel and materiel permeates the entire Saudi armed forces, which is made up of less than 60,000 men. They are divided into an Army, Navy, Coast Guard, the Air Force, and National Guard. And it is the latter two which are clearly the strongest. The National Guard under Prince Abdullah draws recruits from the Bedouin tribes who are known to be extremely loyal. The Guard, which has been pursuing a vigorous modernization program, has the task of protecting the oil fields and the royal family. The Air Force draws from the more educated elements of the population, which include many members of the royal family. American analysts have said that the best of Saudi pilots are equal to the best anywhere, but that the total force is by no means the equivalent of the best in the area. The Israelis, for instance, would greatly outdistance their abilities. The United States has provided the bulk of the planning and training and the equipment for all of these services. The Saudis have currently budgeted $20.7 billion for defense. They are now the single biggest buyer of U.S. military equipment. They have to date rung up purchases from the U.S. totaling $34 billion. Such a small force, no matter how well armed or trained, would be no match for either their stronger, more populated neighbors or for the Soviets. Consequently, the U.S. has asked for bases on Saudi soil and has been resoundingly turned down.
We do not wish the existence of any superpower, any bigger power in this part of the world, in our area.
إيجاد أي قوة للدول الكبرى.
We do whatever we can to protect our independence and sovereignty without the existence of any superpower in our area.
الولايات المتحدة عندما تبرز أشياء كبيرة مثل دور الولايات المتحدة.
However, we may need the help of a friend like the United States if we are seriously and dangerously attacked by another superpower like the Soviet Union, for example. With a bigger power, you need bigger power.
The Saudis do not want to give us bases as such because they say that an official American presence here would mean that Russia would feel that they had to establish even more bases than they presently have. And they could see a weight and counterweight, a building up, and with them being in the middle. They don't want that.
The Saudis felt that having American bases would jeopardize them vis-a-vis the Soviets and their Arab neighbors. What the Saudis do want, what they feel is essential to their survival, is a long-term commitment from the United States in the event of Soviet incursions. And secondly, the ability to buy U.S. aircraft to cover what they see as their current surveillance defense needs. The Saudi request for AWACS became a front-page battle in the United States.
There are three principal conditions, in my view, that must be met in order to make an arrangement with the Saudis. It makes absolutely no sense to turn over this highly sophisticated aircraft to a country who at this time is not capable of flying it or operating it. Now, what is it they want?
The Saudis attributed their AWACS battles to the pressures of the Israeli opposition.
Saudi Arabia is a country which rejects utterly the Camp David Accords, peace and the recognition of Israel, which gives terrific amounts of money to the terrorist organizations, and from which the call to jihad, holy war against Israel, was just issued a few months ago. We have no doubt whatsoever that such a supply of modern, most sophisticated weapons to such a country will undermine peace in the Middle East and will constitute a grave peril to the security of Israel.
Again, quoting the Saudis, you know we're not mad at anybody and we are not going to attack anybody. We've never attacked anybody, and we certainly aren't going to attack Israel because we know that Israel has the best trained and best equipped military force in the Mideast, and we'd be foolish. And besides, Israel doesn't have anything that we want, so why should we attack them?
They eventually got the planes, but after a debate so intense that it did little to allay their increasingly strong doubts about the U.S. as an ally.
What really disturbs and bothers the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is that the American people do not comprehend their interest in the Middle East. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia requests from its friends the arms and weapons to defend itself, but never gets those requests answered except after long and deep struggle.
The Saudis have been concerned that not only do their requests meet with embarrassing debate in the U.S., which to them of itself undermines their security, but that the U.S. so far has accomplished little in dealing with what they see as the real trouble in the Middle East, Palestine and the Israeli position. They believe it undermines the security of the whole region.
The causes of instability, or the chief cause of instability in the whole Mideast, is the Palestinian problem. The justice of the Palestinian cause is a rallying point for all of the Arabs. You combine that with the highly emotional Jerusalem aspect, and you have a solidarity that cuts across factional lines, cuts across party lines throughout the Arab world.
The Palestinian problem is critical to the Saudis at every level. The Saudi public feels strongly about the human rights element.
You can't ignore the Palestinians completely. They are a human being. 3 million Palestinians, you want to consider them to be just an insects? You can't. Lebanon doesn't accept them. Syria doesn't accept them. They are not living in Iraq as peacefully. They are not living anywhere peacefully. Somebody will fight for his own homeland, his family being persecuted, his money being wiped out, in his land being taken, washed out, and he wants to defend himself. They call them terrorists. How they will get their land back? At least, why you are calling for a human, for a human right? Where is the human right there?
The Saudi leadership constantly worries that the 50 to 100,000 Palestinians living in Saudi Arabia will create unrest there, and that the Soviets will take advantage of the problem to strengthen their hold in the Middle East. They finally worry that they must take a stronger stand on behalf of the Palestinians to maintain their posture within the Arab and Islamic world in which they live. Every year, thousands of pilgrims from the entire Islamic world, a community encompassing 40 nations and 800 million people, arrive on the sands of Saudi Arabia to make their visit to the holy places of Islam, the cities of Mecca and Medina. The Saudi monarchy rests on its Islamic legitimacy, its role as defender of the holy places and rights of the Islamic world. The dilemma before the Saudis is apparent. Their desire for a strong relationship with the United States is one they will have to balance with their role within the Islamic world. The Palestinian issue was at the heart of their parting of the ways with the U.S. on the Camp David Accord.
The main reason that the Camp David did not succeed is because it ignored the rights of the Palestinian people. And any attempt to solve the conflict in the Middle East will be a failure without the Palestinians.
The Saudis have set forth their own peace plan, which implies Israel's right to exist along with that of the Palestinians. Fahd's peace plan stipulates that Israel withdraw from the territories occupied in the 1967 war and remove its settlements from the West Bank. It calls for the creation of the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital and guarantees the right of all states in the area to live in peace. The Israelis dismiss the plan as insincere and continue to believe that the Saudis do not ultimately accept their existence.
Crown Prince Fahd talked about the right of all the states in the region to live in peace, and that was taken as an evidence of new Saudi moderation. Unfortunately, the Saudis don't recognize that Israel is a state. Saudi Arabia has a very ambivalent attitude towards Israel. I think it is primarily negative. They acknowledge that Israel is there, but do not acknowledge Israel's right to exist or its permanence in the region. The very idea of a Jewish state is offensive to the Saudis. It is seen as an invasion of Deir al-Islam, the realm of Islam. And indeed, the idea that Jews should rule themselves within the Islamic world is seen as a perversion, literally, of the natural order in which Muslims dominate.
The Saudis, in turn, indicate their peace plan is a serious gesture and that the U.S. should exert its influence over Israel to come to an accommodation for peace.
They have tended to see the issue in fairly simple terms, namely that Israel is heavily dependent on the United States for economic and military assistance, that Israel is illegally occupying Arab territories and denying Palestinian self-determination, and that the Americans should simply order the Israelis to withdraw from the occupied territories and allow the Palestinians their rights. Now, they increasingly have been made aware that the world isn't quite that simple, that the Americans will simply not snap their fingers and order the Israelis to conform, and that even if we tried to, it might not be quite so easy.
The result of all of this is that the Saudis have become increasingly disaffected with the United States at exactly the time that the United States is trying to form a strategic axis in the area. Prince Mughran bin Abdulaziz was trained in the United States as a pilot for the Saudi Air Force and is now governor of a major province.
It's only one-way system, in my opinion. That you have to be my friend, but I have to do whatever, I like, obviously. And the only problem is you are trying, for some unknown reason, to make Saudi Arabia almost the #1 enemy of the guy in the street. Despite all what we've done, we seem to really try our best, but, it's just like you're supposed to do that. Really, we're not supposed to do anything.
The Saudis have done things that we wanted them to do, to protect the dollar, to increase oil production, to keep down oil prices, because we've asked them to do so. There is considerable opposition to this inside the country, by the way. This is perhaps a case where the consensus in the country hasn't been met. But this is being done because they assume that we are honorable men and we are good men, and eventually we will do things that they find important for them, such as to bring about a comprehensive peace settlement in the Middle East on terms that are honorable to all sides. But they haven't gotten anything from us on this. No promises, implied or explicit. Now, I should imagine that if a new generation takes over, they will act as just about any other country in the world does. Not a question of blackmail, it's a question of diplomacy. You want me to do something? Fine, let's talk about that, because we have some things we'd like to have you do.
The Saudis seem to be losing some of their sentimentality about the American connection. I think there was a period when they felt that there was a very special quality to this relationship. Americans had helped them develop their oil, had provided the security assistance and so forth. But more recently, you'll hear Saudis, including the Saudi foreign minister, say things more or less as follows, that great powers do not have friendships. They simply have interests and strategies, and that they will deal with other countries on the basis of those interests and strategies, but not on the basis of friendship, and that we as Saudis should not have any illusions about this and should deal with other powers on the same basis.
The Saudis today are matter of fact about how they see their own goals and power.
And all the Muslims, they look at Saudi Arabia, and this is our real force and our real power. Next to it is oil and the money derived from oil. And we're trying to spend our oil in such a way, as the money we derive from oil, to bring about moderation, to reach a peaceful settlement in the area between the Arabs and the Israelis, and to stop the Russians from any additional gain in our side of the world.
Whether the Saudis ultimately will succeed remains the question. One is increasingly important for the rest of the world as for them. The Saudis have few worries today regarding oil or money. Their dilemma is how to survive the vulnerability that wealth, Soviet intentions, and conflict in the Middle East brings them. In the past, they have relied upon the U.S., but the younger Saudis are dubious today about just how strong an ally the U.S. is. They are clearly watching to see now what the U.S. does to solve the Palestinian problem. The Saudis' foreign policy dilemma today is how to align their U.S. relationship with their regional problems. How they handle this is now the question. And how the U.S., shaken by the death of Sadat, struggling to form a pro-Western axis in the Middle East, handled its foreign policy dilemma is also the question. One thing is clear, the interests from oil to money to peace in the Middle East make the solution crucial.